electricity.
Okay, so hello everyone, morning. Thank you so much for joining the session very early in the morning. I know it's quite early, and for those who are in Indonesia, it's even earlier for you guys. So again, thank you so much for joining. But feel free to have your breakfast, have your coffee while watching the session. I'm mostly still on my PJs, so should be fine. But in this session, basically, what I'm going to talk about is about synthesizing and analyzing um, interview findings typically. So let me introduce myself first. So my name is Naning. I'm currently experienced researcher in SP Digital. And then how I usually would introduce myself is I'm more like a consumer version of Shein because again, Shein is my colleague. We both doing the same thing. It's just Shein is working a lot more on B2B stuff, and I'm working a lot more on the consumer stuff. I'll be looking into two sites because I have my monitor over here and my site is over here, and then your faces is over here. So yeah, in SP, I'm currently in SP Digital for 3 years now, I think. Been doing a lot of research, and then previously I was working in TradeGecko, and then TradeGecko I was working under a product team. So a lot of the things that I did at that time, it was a bit more towards product research for product at least. Working closely with the product managers, working on the roadmap, prioritization, and a lot of things as well. And we built a B2B SaaS software at the time. And then previously, before TradeGecko, I was working in McCann, which is an advertising company. And I was working in building digital strategies and digital campaigns for clients, regional clients in APAC at the time. So just to give a bit of intro, SP Digital to set up context, SP Digital is a company subsidiary company under SP Group. SP Group is an energy company who owns transmission and distribution of energy in Singapore. We also own infrastructure in Australia and China as well. SP Digital is the company who responsible in the digital transformation of SP Group. We are currently consist of 150 professionals. We have about 1.5 million customers, and then we have 1.4 million meters around Singapore at this point. And the things that we built in SP Digital is we built the whole vision of SP Digital is contributing to sustainability, although in for our company, because the space is energy space, so a lot of the things that we do is very focused on reducing energy consumption. So the products that we build when it comes to consumer products, we build products to empower residents in Singapore with insights to make better decisions for their home. And then when it comes to businesses, which is what Shein is doing a lot more, we're trying to help buildings in Singapore to reduce their energy consumption. And we work closely with government to build nationwide projects and efforts as well. So the things that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk a bit more about the process that we have in SPD. And then I'm not going to talk about like how do you do interviews, like how do you create the questions, because in this session, I think you'll be very focused on how you're trying to generate the insights, how you analyze the insights, and how do you report the findings as well. And before we get started, just to set expectation as well, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to share here is more on how we do things. But although obviously it doesn't mean it's the right way to do things as well. It's not the right way. It might be not the right way to do research. I'm not going to tell you like this is the only right thing like to do things. Obviously, it works for our context at least, and a lot of this comes from few iterations as well. And then we also learning, all of us is learning over here. I'm also learning from you guys, so your mileage will vary. Adapt away and teach us as well. I've also provided a handout which you can use, and then the handout is over here, which a lot of the stuff that I'm going to show on the slides I think is more of a summarize and key points. So on the handout, I think is more on the details of things that I'm going to present as well. You can download over here the QR code using the QR code link over here. I think Jill and Shin has blasted the link as well, right? If I'm not mistaken. So yeah. So yeah, a very, very brief about UX research in SB Digital. So when it comes to process, we adopted principles from Lean Startup, which probably a lot of you would be familiar. It is from Eric Rice's book, The Blue Book. And lean is basically like trying to learn about your users and then measuring your effort with data. So how we do things is that when it comes to a kick off a project, for example, we will start most of the time using design workshop. And then when it comes to design workshop, it is meant to be aligning a lot of stakeholders. And then we would produce a lot of designs. And then we would learn from the users basically, which in our case, we use a lot more user interviews. Learn is a stage where you would do a lot more qualitative research, which trying to inform your design decisions, identify your usability issues, and then find solutions for them as well. Findings is based on our impressions, researchers' impressions, interpretation, and prior knowledge as well. Usually in this stage, usually in this stage is more um, smaller sample size because it is not meant to be statistically significant. It is meant to be a qualitative research. So this is the time where we talk to the user and then testing the designs as well. So after we get the designs, we're confident with it, and then we will start build the product, and then we will try to build it as small as possible so that we can get feedback as fast as possible as well. Um, sorry. And then once we've launched the product, and then we would typically use quantitative research. And then when it comes to lean, the quantitative research that we do is a lot more focused on Google data analytics. So we don't really use survey, for example, because we believe that the best way to get feedback from the users is to get the feedback from the users itself, and then by using the product, I think it is already statistically significant because the sample size is basically your users. And then it tracks basically the user behavior indirectly. For our case, we use Google Analytics. And then basically, once we've measured it and then we come up with some insights, and then obviously when it comes to quantitative research, it doesn't really tell why. It tells a lot of things. What are the things that is happening? And to learn more why these things are happening, that's where we would learn again using user interview, and then it would go into a cycle. So this is a typical week for our research look like. We try to deliver in 1 week. Something is wrong with my mouse. But yeah, we try to deliver it in 1 week. And then 1 week, when it comes to 1 week, I guess it's more like about 7 plus 1 day. So 1 week plus. But yeah, we always try to make it as fast as possible to make sure that it's efficient. So we will start the week with typically, we will start on the Thursday, identify topic and target participants with the POs and other stakeholders, and then we will start crafting the research plan. And we try to align with stakeholders. And then when it comes to design workshop, on the first day, we try to start planning for the design workshop as well. And then we will do the workshop on the next day. And then at the same time, when we do the workshop, we also blast the recruitment form so that we have the whole weekend to get the submissions from our pool. We have our user pool, so to do research is quite fast for us. On the Monday, we will get the submission, and then we will start working on the prototype and designs for testing based on the designs that's produced on the workshop on Friday. And then when we blast the recruitment form, typically we would put the available days and dates as well, which is typically will be the Tuesday and the Wednesday. So we would schedule the participants right away. So the next Tuesday and the Wednesday, we will do user interviews. We've experienced interviewing 7 people in a day. So it was in 2 days, it was like about 14 or 15. I'm not really recommending it for your own sanity. And then when we do user interviews, typically like when it comes to like 7 to 10 people. So in a day, typically we would do like 3 to 5 users in the day. At the same time, we try to do the interviews typically like in back to back, but when we have free time, we will start cleaning up the findings, which I'm going to run you through as well later. What do we mean by cleaning up the findings? Then the next day, we will synthesize the findings and then craft the research report. And then by the next Friday, we will present the report and present it to our stakeholders and blast thank you email to users for having gone through the user interview. So In this whole session, what I'm going to focus a lot more is from the Wednesday to Friday session rather than the first few days. Again, so I'm going to start with explaining about few types of findings. Let's imagine we do research about something that I'm extremely passionate about, which is Indomie. Indomie is the Indonesian national instant noodle. That is also apparently a national food in Africa. Fun fact. That tastes heavenly. It's amazing. So how did I define the research topic? Typically, like a quantitative data is a good start. So we can look at Amazon. The review is like more than 1,500 people rated it more than 5-star, which is a good, I think, a good range. It's quite statistically significant when we have like 1,500 people. So let's say, imagine that I'm testing this Indomie to foreigners, for example. And then we've done the user interview, and then we have the raw findings. So what should we do with it? First of all, there are two types of findings. There is observations and insights. When it comes to observation, observations are the building blocks of an insight, and they are just facts. Let's say all of them have tried the Indomie and they all don't like it. The observation pattern would be there is no single users who like the Indomie, which is sub. And then these findings are observations, and these are not insights because they don't tell you why, the motivation and the desired outcome, and all of these facts. So another type of finding would be what we call an insight, which relies more on a leap of intuition. Where in same case, you dig a little deeper as to why people don't like the Indomie, but no one of them can articulate it well, for example. So your insight would be, oh, for example, users who don't like the Indomie are users who are health conscious, for example, and they may be trying to lose weight, underestimated Indonesian food, and not adventurous enough to give it a try, which, yes, I have so much judgment over there. But although, to be really honest, the insights is personally for me as a researcher, it's just that, like, I think you're just missing a lot. But yeah, in order to find an insight, you might have to pull evidence from across all of your interviews and synthesize the findings, as it involves leaps of intuition and it may not always be accurate. That's why we try to make sure that all of the raw findings is comprehensive to make sure that we are neutral, and we represent all the users that we interviewed. I will run through how we analyze our insights to make sure we separate observation and insights clearly and stay neutral as possible. And then when it comes to analysis process, usually it consists of capturing the data, connecting the patterns and the patterns, and then crafting the insights, and then report the findings and tell the story to your stakeholders. I'll start with qualitative data first. Our synthesis process typically will start from taking the notes itself during the interview. You have really good interviews, and the interviews are all comfortable in sharing it a lot, and they don't want. So in SPD, we try to take notes quite detailed, which we then use for analysis and synthesis later on. And this is the structure of our notes. Typically, it would be taken in a spreadsheet like this, and then there would be the name of the users on the first row, and then it will be structured on questions on the left. So let's say I'm hired by Hogwarts to do user interviews, and my notes might look something like this. So in the relevant cell, we will key in the interview's answers to that questions. And then, for example, tell me about yourself, and then they would have Harry will answer, so that the answer we will put it over here. And when it comes to take notes, we take notes on what actually happened. We take notes of exact speech and what actually the things that they actually said. We don't put our thoughts on we don't put our thoughts and opinions. And we say this more about what is happening rather than the solution of what we see as researcher. So we're trying to record their emotions and expressions as possible. And yeah, so that's how we take notes. So typically the notes will be something like this. We even put like the pauses. We even put like the questions that they have. And by having like a detailed factual notes, it would help us a lot more later when we want to refer back to things. it keeps us honest as well, and for other stakeholders to refer as well. Initially, I felt like no one would even look into our notes, but then like by looking into like how people, I got feedback from the stakeholders as well that they do look into our notes, and I see. And so we record most of our insights in most of our repo in Confluence, and then in Confluence now you can actually use the analytics of the page, and then you can see that the page where we put all the notes actually have quite a lot of views as well from our stakeholders. And then thanks to our note-taking process, we've ruled out recording completely. So we don't really do recording, and we don't really do transcribing of interviews because we take note quite comprehensive. The next step that we typically would do is that we will clean up the data. So from previously, you can see that this is typically the notes, and then it's very, very normal that when, for example, we ask Harry one questions, and then they will put like 2 paragraphs, and then like the 2 paragraphs actually already answered the next question. So how we do it is that we make sure that the answers is put in the right columns, the remaining rows and columns for the right questions, to make sure that it is comparable for everything. And then we try to summarize it as well, because when we do start crafting the insights, it's very hard if we don't clean up the notes. It's much easier to compare, to see it in something like this. I'll give it another example, so that is much easier for you to visualize as well. So to set more context, there's one time where we have a project, and then we work on building charging stations network in Singapore. And then at the time what we did is that we have to build an app to help drivers in Singapore to find a charging station. So what we did is that we interviewed drivers in Singapore, and then the notes look something like this. So typically the questions, this is a very small snippet of the notes, actually is quite long. But typically we would have the questions like this, and then we will have the answers over here. Obviously, this is cleaned up already, as in previously it wasn't like this. It wasn't as clean as this. But as you can see as well, when we clean up like this, it's easy to see that this particular users is the one who talks the most, and the ones that give a lot of feedback. And if I didn't put it in a note like this, probably it's very possible that I would be biased to this particular user because he gave a lot of feedback. And because we clean it up like this, it's much easier for us to compare for each of the row for a question. For example, what do you do during charging your car? So when you charge your car, and then we ask the drivers, what did you do? And then because we clean it up like this, it's much easier to see, like most of them, they would have a meal, meal. Probably they would go home as well, go to hawker center. They would sleep inside the car, also some of them. So yeah, it's much easier to see and to compare, to come up with patterns, rather than having it like in a paragraph form, and then we have to see one by one. So this is how we clean up, and then it makes us easier to compare between each of the row, and it makes sure for us to stay neutral and not biased as well. And then, for example, I do remember how much it costs, and then all of them give different answers. But then, like once you clean it up, it's clear. It's easy to see that all of them is actually free. For example, the next example is that I'm going to show you is that one of the features that we built in our app. We have this feature which is called Green Up. So in Green Up, what we do is that basically we try and encourage greener and more sustainable behavior from our residents. And then for every actions or every green activities that you do, you can get rewards with the ones that we provided in our app. So we did test the designs, and then this is typically the notes. So these are the questions that we have in our notes. So this is a typical this is the typical questions that we ask for design questions. So we always start with, first one, is this what you expected to see? So when we show the designs, and we ask this to get first impression, and then to see whether this is what expected from the previous speech. The next question is, what do you think this is? What do you think this is to see whether how they perceive the page, and then see whether they perceive the page as how we designers expect them to perceive it. And then how can you tell is to get the design to see what design elements and components that makes up the perception of the user of the page. So for example, if it's challenges, how can you tell that this is challenges? Is based on the list of challenges, for example. Or else, for example, like, what do you think this is? These are rewards. And then how can you tell? Because of the copy and because of the challenges, for example. What goes through your mind as you look at this? So in this question is typically more for to let the user look into the page again and then really deep dive and then see what they think about it and then give feedback. And then what other information you're looking for is to see if there's any opportunity of content that we need to put. And then what would you do next is to see based from there. So we don't really leave the user to go to the pages that we want to test, but we more like trying to see what is the natural reaction from the user from that particular page where they want to go. And then what do you expect to see when you click whatever they said in the previous page? So for example, what would you do next? My vouchers. What do you expect to see when you click my vouchers? Oh, I expect to see blah, 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 blah. And then when they go to the next page and then we ask the user again, is this what I expected to see? And they're like, well, not really. It's not really what I expected to see, for example. So all of this feedback initially, it was very, very messy. So like, for example, what do you think this is? Some of them, like they put 3 paragraphs of feedback on this particular column. And then how we clean it up is that we make sure that all of the feedback is put into the right questions. And then once we clean up, we summarize it like this. It's much easier for us to compare. So for example, like how can you tell? And then we can tell the designers that, from this particular page, the copy, the list of the challenges, the icons, and the leaves as well, helps the user to understand that this page is a rewards page, for example. So we'll move on to quantitative data. When it comes to quantitative data, this is how we structure the sheet. So typically it was structured by time or sprint. And then typically it would be, instead of based on the questions, we would structure it based on the customer journey. And then based on the customer journey will be based on the customer journey of the product that you have. And then the products and features inside the app. For example, like if you have like a super app, then probably like you would have like exact products or exact pages that you really want to look at. And then maybe releases. And then when it comes to releases, what are the things that we release? And then the campaigns is to see what are the campaigns that is happening so that we can see, for example, if there's an increase over here, then we know what are the external factors that contributes to this particular number, for example. So obviously fake numbers. This is not numbers. This is numbers that we came up with. But yeah, it could be by sprint. It could be by a month. We currently, I think we track it by month. So this is the customer journey that we have. And then obviously this is also fake metrics, but typically, for example, if you have engagement, then maybe you look into the numbers of the metrics that that you want to measure for this particular stage. It could be 1, it could be more than 1. And then, for example, when it comes to payment, it could be like how many is purchase, how many is transaction, volume of transaction, for example. Then we can also look into the deep dive into the screens as well. So yeah, this is how we look into quantitative for data analytics for now. So when it comes to write report, and then usually when it comes to analysis, again, this is a stage. And then when it comes to user interviews, we have raw findings. And then we have, when it comes to analytics, we would typically have a dashboard. And then when it comes to Connect, we're trying to see it from the cleanup findings, the summarized findings. And then for analytics, we would look into spreadsheet as well, the one that I just showed you. But when it comes to craft and storytell, usually it's always the same process. You try to find the key themes and then you come up with the insights and then you'll work into the report. So how do we craft the insights? Some tips on crafting a report is that's a practice within your company is that first one, make sure that your data is complete and comprehensive so that your findings are believable. And we also rely a lot on the intuition and on the leap of faith. But again, because we know that the process on crafting the insights is there's a lot of intuition and leap of faith that goes into it. And that's why we have a very comprehensive notes and to make sure that when it comes to intuition, at least it's based on a very neutral and unbiased data as well. And then we try to do this in a team. By doing it in a team, it keeps us honest and helps us figure out perspective that we might be missing. So a lot of times, like when I try to come up with the insights, I would try to get feedback from Shiyun as well. Same way she wants to present something, then she would get feedback from me as well. I think that's the best thing about working in a company where you have multiple researchers, because you can learn a lot more from other researchers and get feedback on the things that you do as well. We try to tell specific stories as well. So we always tell, like when we show an insight, and then we tell, like, for example, this one time a user that is yada yada yada, for example, or it happened to the users who yada yada yada, for example. And the best way to tell the stories about the users is to add quotes and add pictures if the user gives permission. So as in, like, we always, every time you do the interviews, we always ask the user, like, whether they're okay to, if we take picture of them, because it would be more helpful for our report. But we try to explain to them, like, are we going to present this to our stakeholders? And typically when we present to stakeholders, the insights will be much more useful when there's a photo of it. So we always explain to them, and if they say no, then that's fine. We will put like illustrations photos. But if they say yes, then that would be amazing as well. Then we'll put their photo. So you have your findings from numbers and your interviews, and then we have to share them out, obviously, right? So ideally, your stakeholders should have been with you along your synthesis and analysis process. But otherwise, you still want to document your observation patterns and insight, right? So generally, an insight is supposed to be informative. It's supposed to be answering the questions that you have, by telling you what the users want and needs and their pain points. And then it has to be inspiring as well. So it has to be, doesn't make you feel something in order to do something, for example. So when an insight is inspiring, it will show you what are the next steps should be. And it's supposed to be memorable. It is phrased in a way that it will stick with you, and be easy to share with others. So a good sign to see whether your insight is memorable is to see whether your stakeholders are still talking about your insights a few months after the sharing. And the biggest mistake when people synthesize findings is that when people write insights and they mistake observations as insights. So let's do another example. And again, something that I'm really passionate about, which is martabak manis. So as you can see in the slide, that this is a martabak manis. In Singapore, we call it mitiang kue. In Malaysia, they call it terang bulan. And outside Southeast Asia, let's just say this is like an amazing pancake. And yeah, this is how we take pancake. We take it very, very seriously. Imagine that, again, we're interviewing a bunch of foreigners and test this martabak to them. So I'll try to see, like, we try, let's say, like, we try to craft an insight. So for example, like, the martabak doesn't seem to fit with users' taste buds. Is it informative? It's not really informative, because it doesn't really, like, what, it doesn't really tell, like, why, it doesn't really tell, like, how much. There's not much layers of information that is there on this particular insight. So let's try to tweak it again. 5 out of 7 users rated the martabak as 6. They mentioned that the texture was greasy and felt unhealthy. So it is informative. It gives more understanding of the feedback. It's quite inspiring, but I think it's not really memorable. So how do we try to tweak it again and make it memorable? So when it comes to like 5 out of 7 users, probably like most of the users anyway. And then a good way to put as well is to put the exact terms of the users, the exact terms that the user used to give feedback of the product. So for example, like, we can tweak it like, users find the martabak disgusting. Probably that's the exact word that they put, and too greasy and unhealthy as well. Is it informative? Yes, and it is inspiring, and I guess it is also memorable as well. And also we put a lot of the because we put like a quote, the exact quote from the user, it makes it more memorable. But I guess for me, again, the insight for me is like, why though? It's like the best food in the world. But yeah. So this is an example of the report that we have. So typically when it comes to report, we would have like the insight, and then we will have the quotes from the user and the photos. Obviously, typically it would be like a real photos, but because I can't really share it because of PDPA over here. So we would have a main insight, and typically we would have like some secondary insights to help to support the main insight as well. So this is a report that I did for the EV charging stations research as well. So we were talking about after we launch it, and then these are the value propositions that we can get for the charging stations that we have. And when it comes to sharing the findings, I think most of the people will come to your session, and the most actionable things that you can share is the design changes. So people will go to your session to see what are the things like you as a researcher, you should tell me like what I need to do. And the most actionable stuff that we can do is to show the design changes. So we always, that's why when we do interviews, we always try to make sure that we come up with like a design recommendations as well, so that it's not just like some stories about the users and then what. So the action items usually is the design changes. So we will always show the previous design, and then we would also show the next the design recommendations that we provide. And then we also point out like why is it not working, and then maybe why is this working, and so on and so on. Sometimes we put the quotes as well from the user for some particular elements as well. And that's it. So we've talked a lot about how we do research in SB Digital. We've talked a lot about generating insights and reporting findings, and probably I've talked a lot about some amazing Indonesian food as well. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Naning, for that sharing. You are definitely not off the hook because we have a ton of questions for you.
Is it?
So yeah, a ton. Thank you so much, everyone, for going to the Pigeonhole link. If you haven't yet, it's in the chat for both Zoom and YouTube. So please go in there, upvote your questions, and we're going to be answering them right now. So Shirin is going to share her screen with some of the questions. But I would say that broadly, some of the most upvoted questions that we saw were around note-taking. So I think maybe a bit more on that would be helpful for the group. So the most upvoted question here being, how do you capture such detailed notes? Do you really type that fast?
Yes. So this one actually, yes, I do type quite fast to the point where, so there are times where when we do interviews, and then when we do interviews and then we would share it, we would cast the session to the teams outside the meeting room, the interview session. And I do get feedback a lot to the point where my stakeholders would tell me like, I can hear your keyboard louder than the user saying things. So, but yeah, which is a bad thing anyway. So, but yeah, I try to type softer as well. But yeah, thankfully, Shun and I, we type quite fast. To the point where a lot of times, like when we type notes and then when it's like above like 1 hour, or like in the minute of 45 minutes or like 50 minutes, and then like sometimes we are very tired and then we just type on the notes, because like usually when we do interviews, we would type notes, and then one of us would be typing notes, and then one of us would be taking the lead of the research. So, for example, like me and Shion, sometimes I take notes and then Shion will lead the interview. And then by the time we're 45 minutes or 50 minutes, and then Shion would look into my notes as well, because it helps active listening as well. So obviously, probably like for some people like us, we sometimes we try to listen to the user, but a lot of times we like, it doesn't really need to go to our head, because it requires a lot more focus to really listen to the user too. So by looking into the notes live, I think it helps a lot us for a researcher to go back to the previous answers that they have while asking the question. So for example, like because Shion is looking on the notes, then Shion can say, oh, based on your answer on previous question, then yada yada yada, for example. And sometimes like by 45 minutes, I'm very tired, and then I just put on the notes like, shit, I'm so tired, or like, shit, my fingers is hurt, my fingers are numb, because I sound to some people talk really, really fast. So when it comes to talking with users, we don't really, when it comes to like talking with users and consumer or residents in Singapore, we don't really record anymore. But sometimes when it comes to B2B, because there's a lot of like very, very complex, complex terms, sometimes we have to record, because it's not, we can't hear, we don't even know what they're talking about. So that's why we record more, like to make sure that we really take notes, everything. So yeah.
Interesting. Do you ever use like transcription services or not really?
We do try, we do explore. Most of them obviously doesn't really work with Singlish, apparently,
Okay, yeah, that's true.
unfortunately.
That's true.
But if
That's
any
true.
of you who can find any transcription software that works with Singlish, please let me know. That would be amazing, very helpful. We try a lot of things, but most of them doesn't really work with Singlish.
Makes sense. There was another really upvoted question for group note taking.
Yeah.
How do you consolidate the insights and make a report from multiple people taking notes?
We don't do Sharon, feel free to add as well, because like we always work together, but we never do group note taking. But when it comes to like, sometimes we want to put the stakeholders to join the session as well, to uh, immerse themselves with the users. We always train them, or at least brief them on how to note and to do note taking properly, how we believe how to do note taking properly. Because most of the people, how they do take notes, what's important for people is very subjective, right? So we always tell them that you take notes like this, you take exactly what they say, and you even put like the pauses, you put like the la, the le, the walao, the everything. So yeah, we always try to make sure before every stakeholders join our interview, we always make sure that we tell them how to do take notes. And yeah, we don't really do group note taking.
Okay, interesting.
Yes.
Okay, so another question is, how do you determine what's useful from your quantitative data and how to create action around it to improve the app?
I think it matters a lot when it comes to like again, the whole research process, it starts not only like when you have the data, right? Like before you even have the data, when you talk to the stakeholders, I think one of the key things that you need to understand as well is what are the things that the stakeholders are looking for. So that's how you always talk to the stakeholders first before any research project or any research effort. We tell them like what metrics you want to change, why you want to change this metrics, so what outcome you expected to have by changing this metric, for example. Why do you measure this metric, for example? So when we know all of this expectation from people, then we understand like what are the things that they are looking for. So when we look into the data, I think for me, I never really, obviously, like when it comes to raw findings, like there's a huge ton of raw findings, but the ones that we presented is the one that the stakeholders are looking for, and the ones that we as researchers believe that is the most important thing to tell. So yeah, usually like if it's like a very big, and then we always put like probably like less than half of it, because we want to make sure that the whole session is there's a quality of the session, and we share the most important research insights.
Nice. I think going back a little bit to notes, how do you manage the quality of note taking across a team? And this is a really interesting question because I've definitely worked with people who take notes in very different ways. I think people have like different styles of taking notes too. So yeah, I'm curious how you deal with it.
I do have again, so the whole process is based on a few iterations of processes, and we didn't come up with this process one time and then like that's it. As in like it comes into this process that we have after a few iterations. So we even have like a slides of like, no, actually Shun came up with this slide. So we even have like a slides of note taking one-on-one. So we even have, again, so we every time like we stakeholders want to join our session, we always tell them like, this is how to take notes, this is not how to take notes, these are the type of notes that we take. Sometimes we even tell them like, this is a bit of briefly about like how the analysis process, so they know that how do we take insights based on those notes. So yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay. Well, there's another question here that I thought was interesting, which is okay. Okay. This one has been more uploaded. How many of you are usually working on a single research project, and how do you divide the work? So the question is from Jose.
So our team of research, as in the whole experience design team, we are consists of 7 people. We have 3 designers and we have 3 researchers. So the researchers consist of myself, Shun, and Rebecca, another researcher, amazing researcher that we have as well. So typically when it comes to research, there will always be one lead of the research lead for the project. Obviously, all of us, we always handle more than 2 or 3 projects. We always handle like probably like 4 or 5 research projects. But yeah, there will be one who's responsible to the research project. And then typically like we would just taking turns. Like for example, if Shirin is taking a lead of the research, then Rebecca and I would take turns on taking the notes. But the rest of the analysis process, Shion would typically do it. But again, like when we do the analysis of the insights, then we would need some feedback. So it's a bit of teamwork as well. Like when we have the insights, then sometimes Shion would present to me, share it to me, and then I would give feedback. I think you need to change to it like this and like that. Da, da, da. So a lot of it, I think, something that we need to improve. At least for me. Okay, so I know some people can take notes while talking, but I can't really. I really can't. I tried previously in my previous work. I do try to take notes in while talking to users, and it's just extremely hard. And to the point where we started sacrificing the notes, and I realized that it affects the insights that I present because I will take notes more of people who complain the most, for example, or people who gave feedback the loudest, for example. So that's why like we take notes quite seriously because we want to make sure that everything is neutral and unbiased. And I realized that when I take notes while talking, it would affect the biasness of the insights as well. So that's why we try to change turns and help each other when it comes to taking the notes. But yeah, 3 of us, we take notes very, very fast. We type very fast. So that helps a lot.
Nice. I definitely agree that I cannot take notes when I'm talking either.
Yes, I do. I do know some people do though. As in, like, if any of you can take notes while talking, that would be amazing. I really support you, but I really can't. It's just extremely hard.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I was going to say there is a fairly upvoted question that related to what you were saying, where you were saying like minimizing bias. So this question from here is, when you clean up the notes, how do you ensure that you're capturing the user's intent without bias? Yeah.
When I clean up the notes, typically like we don't even put, so to the point where we clean up the notes, we don't put any of our thoughts. We clean it up based on the feedback. So it's more like summarizing rather than analyzing, I would say. So as in like when as you can see on the notes that I've shown to you, like it's more of summarizing of what they do. It's just what they say to help us to compare between each of the columns. But it's not like when they say like they're confused, for example. It's not like I put it the summary as like, oh, we have to change it, something like this. We didn't put like that. So we never put any thoughts on the summarized notes, the cleanup notes. After we clean up the notes, that's the time we put our thoughts on. We put an analysis process and we start crafting the insights. So that way is really unbiased.
Yes. You mentioned quite a bit on like intuition. And yeah. I thought this was a really good question as well, which is, how do you build up that intuition as you go from observation to insight?
So okay,
you were just born
I realized as well. Yeah, I realized on this, right. When I don't take notes, the intuition would be very, very drawn to the people who are the loudest, for example. Like it will be a lot more based on the people who complain the most. So for example, like one of the EV driver, they told me like one of them, he told me about like because the charging station takes 2 hours, and then like they have to, sorry, there's a renovation sound. But yeah, because of the charging station takes about 2 hours to charge. And then what they do is that what he did is that he has to charge in early in the morning. So he wake up at 3 a.m. and then he would bring in his bolster and his pillow and his blanket. And then what he did is that he would charge the car and then he would go back to sleep in the car, which is extremely sad. But again, if I don't take the notes properly, if I didn't clean it up, I would probably tell that story the most. But when I clean up, then I realize only one user that talk about it. So again, I think the intuition would come in by itself. But I guess when we don't really clean up the notes properly, the intuition would be very, very biased to the people that we talk to and how they talk to us. But when we clean it up, the intuition will come in by itself. It's much easier to take the intuition from there because a lot of it, the pattern is there already. But yeah, that's how it is.
Nice. Cool. Well, has the way that you've done research, synthesis, and analysis changed since we've all gone remote?
Right now, I think we take recordings now, typically more for the B2B research. It doesn't change it. For that particular one, I think we've been recording even before because there's a lot of things that we don't understand when we talk to users. Like, it's very common when you do B2B research. Most of the time, you wouldn't even understand what the user is talking about. So I think when it comes to remote, the changes is more on the governance side of things. So like how we do the paperwork, how we do the consent form, how we pay the incentive, how do we get the receipt after paying the incentive. I think that changes the most rather than the research process and the interview process itself.
Yeah, I think for digital products, I feel like largely the process is mostly the same, I guess. Yeah,
yes.
I would be curious. Well, if anyone in the Zoom or the YouTube has comments on research for physical products, I think we'd be keen to hear how that's become different.
Yeah.
For us, like people in the digital world, I feel like the process has stayed pretty similar.
Yes, definitely.
There was a question about tools. I think you showed kind of like an Excel or like Google Sheet tool, but are there any other tools that you use for data organization and analysis?
No, we don't really use them. I tried to play the YouTube video and then it lags for 10 seconds. So like it's super distracting. I'm listening to myself. Anyways, I just closed the YouTube. I turned on the YouTube. I'm like, shit, what is it? But yeah, we only use Google Sheet. Initially, we use Google Docs for creating the research plan. Now we use Confluence. And then Google Slides to create the slides. I know, like, I think when it comes to presentation of the findings, I think it really depends on the stakeholders as well. Like previously when I was in Trigeco, like I would use a lot more Confluence to report the findings, and we do a lot of what do you call it, atomic reports, atomic sharing the findings, like how we just put it in the Confluence and then like because we want to make it as fast as possible to share. In our case, it's very hard to do it because we have a lot more stakeholders. The challenge in managing stakeholders is harder. And then that's why like we take sharing the findings quite seriously, and then we try to make sure in the whole sharing sessions that it is it's a session where we really share like good insights, and we make sure that we take storytelling quite seriously as well to make sure that we can convince the stakeholders as well.
I think there's another question that says, what are some metrics and KPIs one would consider when you're redesigning an enterprise product?
Actually, this one is probably better for Shiyun though to answer.
Not to throw her under the bus, but I would agree. I mean,
yes, but yeah, I guess that it really depends on the product. I think we do have when it comes to user behavior metrics, I think it shouldn't be different. Again, it always go back to the customer journey. But when it comes to B2B products, I would say, at least in my previous experience, we do track a lot more business metrics. So for example, like CAC, LTV, ARPU, for example, like a lot of the business metrics that we track, which I think it's more to understand how the user use the product, and then but when it comes to user behavior metrics, usually it's not really that different with the consumer products, because again, it always goes back to your customer journey and what you want to track as well, what the POs want to track as well.
Yeah. I think that ties in nicely with the next question that I'm going to pose to you, which is a question from Kim. Could you share more how data analytics are related to your CJM? I'm assuming CJM is customer journey map. If Kim is around and I'm interpreting that wrongly, please let me know. But I'm assuming it means customer journey map.
Could you share more how data analytics are related? So typically, like I think when it comes to sharing the how we monitor the sheet for analytics is that it goes back to the journey map. So obviously every company would have the journey flow. For us, I think we trying to refer to, if you are familiar from late analytics book, we refer to pirate metrics from Dave McClure, if I'm not mistaken, and then from there, then for each of the stage of the journey map, then we define, obviously not we define, as in together with the POs and other stakeholders, we define the most important metrics for that particular stage of the journey. So for example, when it comes to payment, what are the metrics that we want to track during that payment? Is it for business metrics would be like transaction value, or maybe like transaction volume, for example. But when it comes to user behavior metrics, probably like how many people click the payment button, for example, how many people pay through this and pay through that, for example. So yeah, usually like every stage of the journey flow, we define together with the stakeholders, we define the most important metrics that we need to measure for each of the stage.
Cool, great. So I think we have time for like one more question. I want to be mindful of everyone's time and end within the hour. So for the last question, maybe we can, let me see. Okay, we answered a fair bit, especially around
I see
bias.
some of the names of the those who answer the questions is Lim, which I guess. Never mind.
Hold on, that was one. Oh yeah, so this one, how do you handle answers or information from participants which don't fit within the questions in the column, or maybe within the scope of what you're researching?
Yes. That's why we clean up, because when we clean it up, we only put the information that is important there. No, relevant information to that particular question. Then for those that is not relevant, typically we just put like so for every section of our questions, we would have like an empty row. That's where like irrelevant questions over there. So it's very common, for example, for people that we talk to. For example, we have, as I mentioned, we have a feature which is green up. And then, for example, we bring in the users to talk about other features that we have, like payment, for example. And then, like when we talk about payments, and some people will come in and they are green up users, and they would give feedback about, oh yeah, I've been using green up for a while. Actually, I've changed my behavior now, blah blah blah. So that particular feedback doesn't really relate to the research topic that we talk about, and it's very, very common. But usually we just put it outside. Again, it's not because it's not relevant to the research project that we have, but I guess like they would keep that inside, and then for more to share it with the team as well, more like an ad hoc sharing. Usually we just put it on Slack, or else we would put it on Confluence.
Nice. Cool. Yeah, I think I guess the dream would be to have like a searchable like mega database where you can put all the insights.
I think is very, it's not really a dream. I think it's the possible. The dream is the part where you can have like clean up notes or transcribe notes from Singlish. That's a part that I'm still waiting until today. But yeah.
Startup idea, but the market will be very small.
Yes, unfortunately, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I think we've come to the end of the session. For the rest of the questions that we didn't manage to get to, Naning, Shin, and I will take a look and hopefully follow up with you all after the session. So we will contact you through the meetup group, as well as through the Slack channels that we have within the Design Sprint APAC group. So thank you so much, everyone, again for joining us today. And yeah, have a great day, night. We will ping you with other. Oh yeah, okay, great. Shin just shared a whole list of links over here for feedback, to connect with us, to connect with Naning, as well as to get amazing food recommendations for martabak and others. Bread, sourdough bread. She knows all the best bread. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.